In the winter of 1961, a hospital maintenance worker named Roland Cheswick descended through a service corridor beneath Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts that had been sealed with poured concrete for nearly 40 years. He carried a kerosene lantern, a hand-drawn schematic pulled from the building's original 1878 architectural file, and a crowbar borrowed from the boiler room. The corridor was not in any modern floor plan. It did not appear on any maintenance record filed after 1923. The walls were tiled in white, floor to ceiling, with a drainage channel running the length of the center. Iron hooks were spaced at 18-inch intervals along both sides. When Roland Cheswick finally reached the chamber at the end of that corridor, a circular room approximately 30 feet in diameter, the first thing he said to his supervisor was that the room had been in active use far more recently than anyone had told him. The second thing he said was that he would not go back down there alone. The official record from Danvers State Hospital states that Cheswick was reassigned to exterior grounds maintenance within 6 days of that incident. The reason given in the personnel file was a routine departmental restructuring. What those files do not mention is that Roland Cheswick had worked the same underground maintenance rotation for 11 years without a single reassignment. He was not an unstable man. He was a 22-year veteran of facility maintenance who had personally overseen the repiping of the hospital's entire East Wing steam system. He had a service commendation dated 1957. Within 3 weeks of his report, the sub-basement access point was sealed a second time, this time with steel plate welded to the frame, not concrete. Within 2 months, the original 1878 architectural schematic that Cheswick had pulled from the building's files was reclassified as a preservation document and removed to the Massachusetts State Archive, where it remains restricted to credentialed academic researchers to this day. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as compelling as I do, hit subscribe so the next one reaches you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you actively tell it otherwise. To understand what Cheswick found and why the people running Danvers responded the way they did, we have to go back, not just to the 1920s or the 1930s. We have to go back to 1878, the year the hospital first opened its doors, and to a period in American institutional history that has been so thoroughly sanitized in modern retellings that most people have no idea what was actually happening inside the walls of these buildings. The late 19th century was not simply an era of medical progress. It was an era of almost total institutional secrecy. Danvers State Hospital, originally called the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers, was built on a hill outside of Salem, Massachusetts, at a cost of approximately $1.5 million. The architects were Nathaniel Jeremiah Bradley, and for the later additions, the firm of Hartwell and Richardson. The design followed what was called the Kirkbride Plan, a specific architectural philosophy developed by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride of Pennsylvania that called for massive, bat-wing-shaped buildings with long corridors radiating from a central administrative core. The Kirkbride Plan was sold to state legislatures as a humanitarian model. Fresh air, natural light, gradual institutional recovery for patients who would otherwise live and die in county jails or private homes. That was the public account. The private account, the one you find only in the internal correspondence between hospital superintendents from that era, tells a different story entirely. Dr. Charles Page, who served as superintendent of Danvers from 1891 to 1912, wrote in a series of letters to the Massachusetts Board of Lunacy and Charity that the hospital's lower-level facilities were being used for what he called procedural containment of the unmanageable cases. He used that phrase 9 times across a span of 4 letters. He never defined it. He never attached a list of procedures. In a letter dated November of 1903, he wrote only that the lower corridor access should be restricted to senior medical staff, and that the existing documentation of the sub-basement layout should be reviewed for what he called appropriate archival handling. That letter still exists in a partial form in the Essex County Historical Records. 3 pages of the original 7-page document are missing. The Board of Lunacy and Charity's response to that letter does not appear anywhere in the public archive. Dr. Page was not operating in a vacuum. He was corresponding with superintendents at no fewer than 8 other state hospitals during the same decade. And those letters, the ones that still survive, which is not all of them, show a coordinated pattern of language around the subject of lower-level facility use. They use the phrase procedural containment consistently. They used the phrase administrative discretion when referring to decisions made in the lower levels that were not documented in the main patient record system. And in one letter exchanged between Page and the superintendent of the Buffalo State Hospital in New York, dated March of 1907, the phrase used is simply the lower work, with no further elaboration, as if both men understood exactly what that meant and saw no need to define it for each other. That letter exists in the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society's archive. It is not cited in any academic paper on the history of either institution. Danvers was not unique. That is what makes this worth examining with the kind of attention it has never received in mainstream historical writing. In 1924, workers renovating the basement of Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in Morris Plains, New Jersey, discovered a network of underground passages connecting the main building to 3 outbuildings that did not appear on any official floor plan. The passages were tiled. They contained iron fixtures bolted to the walls. The official explanation given by the hospital administration was that the passages had been used for steam pipe access during the building's original construction. The steam pipe theory was later noted in a single paragraph in a 1967 Regional Historical Journal to be inconsistent with the actual location of Greystone's boiler system, which ran on the opposite side of the building from where the passages terminated. In 1936, a state inspector named Alva Moorfield visited the Athens Lunatic Asylum in Athens, Ohio, as part of a routine capacity review. His report, filed with the Ohio Department of Public Welfare, described a series of rooms on the asylum's lowest level that did not correspond to any of the spaces listed in the building's licensed capacity documentation. The rooms were small. They had no windows. Each had a single iron ring bolted to the floor at the center. Moorfield noted in his report that the rooms were in apparent active use based on the condition of the fixtures. The Athens Lunatic Asylum's official capacity report for that same year listed the lower level as inactive storage. Moorfield's inspection report was not referenced in any subsequent state filing. When a researcher at Ohio University attempted to locate the original document in 1988, the Department of Public Welfare's predecessor agency confirmed it had been transferred to off-site storage in 1971 and could not be located. In 1948, a physician named Dr. Harold Torrance, who had been on staff at Eloise Hospital in Westland, Michigan for 19 years, submitted a formal complaint to the Wayne County Board of Supervisors. The complaint described specific sub-level rooms at Eloise that he said were being used for experimental procedural work on patients who had not provided consent and who, in several cases he documented by patient number, had not been diagnosed with any condition that would legally justify their commitment. Within 60 days of filing that complaint, Dr. Torrance's medical license was suspended by the Michigan State Medical Board on grounds of professional misconduct. He was 53 years old. He had no prior disciplinary record. He died in 1952 from what the death certificate listed as cardiac arrest. He had been working on a second formal complaint at the time of his death, according to his wife, who gave a brief statement to a local newspaper that has never been referenced in any historical account of Eloise Hospital. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. The Kirkbride plan itself deserves more scrutiny than it has ever received from mainstream historians. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride published his foundational text on hospital construction in 1854. The book was adopted almost universally by state legislatures throughout the second half of the 19th century. Kirkbride's stated principles were sound and, by the standards of his era, genuinely compassionate. Natural ventilation, sunlight in patient rooms, space for supervised outdoor activity. These principles appear throughout the published text and throughout the legislative testimony that accompanied hospital construction proposals across the country. What does not appear in the published text, what appears only in the private correspondence between Kirkbride and the architects he personally approved for Kirkbride Plan hospitals, is any mention of the sub-basement specifications. The published plan shows basement levels designated for laundry, storage, and mechanical systems. The construction contracts for hospitals built to Kirkbride's personal approval, in the cases where those contracts survive, contain a separate section that uses language his published text never uses. The words administrative lower facilities appear in the Danvers construction contract. The words procedural sublevel appear in the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum construction contract, which is held in the West Virginia State Archive. The words in the Greystone contract, in the one section of that document reproduced in a 1994 regional preservation study, describe a below-grade facility to be built to specifications provided under separate cover. Specifications which were not attached to the main contract and which have never been located. But here is what makes this case different from every other account of institutional secrecy in this period. The separate sub-basement specifications, the ones not attached to the main contracts, were not provided by the architects. They were provided by a private entity called the National Association for Medical Facility Standards, which was incorporated in Washington, D.C. in 1863 and dissolved without public notice in 1921. No record of this organization's membership, funding sources, or governing documents has ever been found in any public archive. Its name appears in 4 separate hospital construction contracts spanning 3 states and 40 years. And then it disappears entirely from the historical record, as if it never existed. The American Psychiatric Association has never explained why the original construction contracts for more than a dozen Kirkbride hospitals, including Danvers, Greystone, Trans-Allegheny in West Virginia, and the Rochester State Hospital in New York, contained line items for lower-level facility construction that were listed as separate from the main building contracts and billed to a different ledger account than all other construction expenses. It is never explained why those separate ledger accounts, in the cases where records still exist, were funded not by state appropriations but by a small number of private charitable foundations whose donor lists have never been made public. It is never explained why the decommissioning process for Kirkbride hospitals, which began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1990s, consistently prioritized the demolition and concrete filling of sub-basement spaces before any other phase of the decommissioning work, even when those spaces were, according to official records, simply unused storage. These questions do not disappear because they are inconvenient. There is also the matter of the patients themselves, specifically the patients who entered these institutions during the period in question, and whose records were never properly closed. In 1973, a paralegal named Dorothy Haas, working for a Massachusetts legal aid organization, spent 14 months attempting to trace the fates of 312 patients admitted to Danvers State Hospital between 1890 and 1920, whose files contained no discharge, no transfer, and no documented death. The hospital's response to her inquiry was that the records for that period were incomplete due to 2 separate floods in the record storage area. one in 1931 and one in 1944. Dorothy Haas filed a formal records request with the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, which acknowledged her request in writing and then provided no further response for 2 years. When she followed up in 1975, she was told the department had no record of receiving her initial inquiry. She retired from legal aid work in 1977. The 312 patients were never accounted for. What connects all of this? Cheswick's sealed corridor, Moorfield's ringed rooms, Torrance's lost complaint, Dorothy Haas's vanished patients, is the recorded conversation that Thomas Cheswick kept on an audio reel in his home in Peabody, Massachusetts, until his own death in 2004. Roland Cheswick had kept 38 years of silence. He broke it in 1999. He was 71 years old and, by his nephew's account in the transcription notes, completely clear in his recollection. Thomas Cheswick donated that reel to a small regional historical society. A volunteer archivist transcribed portions of it in 2009. The full transcript has never been published, but the portion that was transcribed contains one specific detail that connects directly to the architectural records pulled from Danvers after Roland's reassignment. Roland described the circular room at the end of the sealed corridor as having a recessed ceiling with a central ring fixture, identical in its physical description to the rooms Alva Moorfield had documented at the Athens Lunatic Asylum 13 years earlier. 2 men, 2 institutions, 1,000 miles apart, the same room. Consider what that means for a moment. The Athens Lunatic Asylum and Danvers State Hospital were designed by different architects, funded by different state legislatures, and separated by more than a decade of construction. There is no publicly documented reason why a specialized circular room with a recessed ceiling ring fixture would appear in both buildings. It is not a standard feature of the Kirkbride plan as published. It does not appear in Kirkbride's original text or in any of the architectural drawings that have been released to the public from that era. The only common thread between the 2 buildings that the available documentation supports is the involvement of the National Association for Medical Facility Standards, the entity that provided the separate sub-basement specifications under cover, the one that dissolved without notice in 1921, the one that left no membership records, no funding disclosures, and no governing documents in any public archive anywhere in the United States. If that organization specified a circular room with a central fixture for hospitals in Massachusetts and Ohio, it almost certainly specified the same room for every other hospital it touched. That is potentially more than a dozen institutions. And in every one of those institutions, the sub-basement was sealed before the building was converted, demolished, or transferred to a new owner. In 2006, when the Danvers State Hospital property was sold to a private development firm that converted the main building into luxury condominium units, a project called Avalon Danvers, the development contract included a specific clause requiring the developer to permanently seal all sub-basement access points before any residential construction could begin. That clause was not part of standard environmental remediation requirements for buildings of that era. It was a separate, specifically negotiated contractual provision. The developer's project manager, in a brief comment to a local Massachusetts newspaper during the construction period, said only that the clause had been required by the property's previous owner as a condition of sale, and that his team had complied with it without inspecting the spaces being sealed. He did not say who the previous owner was, specifically, when that requirement was first put in writing, or what legal authority had determined that inspecting the spaces was unnecessary. The newspaper did not follow up. The official history of American psychiatric medicine tells us that the asylum era, for all its documented failures, was fundamentally a well-intentioned attempt to provide care for people who had no other options. What the evidence, the missing documents, the sealed corridors, The identical rooms found in hospitals built from the same architectural plan across 5 decades and a dozen states, tells us is that there were spaces inside these buildings that the people running them were never willing to account for publicly. And when those spaces were eventually discovered by maintenance workers, inspectors, and physicians who asked the wrong questions, the response was always the same. Seal it. Reclassify the records. Reassign the witness. Roland Cheswick spent the last 23 years of his working life maintaining the exterior grounds of Danvers State Hospital. He never returned to the sub-basement. He never filed a formal report about what he found. He told his nephew once, in the recorded conversation that still exists on a tape reel in a regional archive in Essex County, that the thing that stayed with him most was not the room itself. It was the drainage channel. He said it was the cleanest thing in the building, not dusty, like everything else down there, not corroded, not aged, clean, as if someone had made a point of keeping it that way, long after anyone was supposed to have been down there at all. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If you have made it this far, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. And the people who sealed those corridors were counting on exactly that. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects what happened at Danvers to a specific 1903 federal report on institutional land grants, a document that was printed in a limited run of 40 copies, distributed to 11 state governors, and has not appeared in any public archive since 1941. You will not want to miss it.